The due date was yesterday, but I didn't have a show yesterday, so I decided to have this guy on today. And this guy is Andrew Lautz, who is the Director of Federal Policy for the National Taxpayers Union Foundation. And Andrew Lautz, welcome to 700 WLW. It's good to talk to you, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing great. I had Pete Sepp on this show a couple of months ago, and it was great talking to him. And I'm glad to have you tonight. And, you know, I call this show the Midweek Crisis. And that's because seemingly every day with this administration, there's a new crisis. But I look at your website, the National Taxpayer Union Foundation, and I look at some of these headlines. 19 states publish private info about taxpayers. Your tax data at risk. Why the IRS must prioritize cybersecurity. 6.5 billion hours. 260 billion. What tax complexity costs Americans. It goes on and on and on. Democrats want Janet Yellen to do their death taxing for them. You guys don't sugarcoat anything over there. And if I could, when it comes to crises, I could do crises just talking about what's going on with taxes in this country. It's amazing.
Oh my gosh, it is, and we try to give it straight to folks around the country. Tax code is confusing enough as it is. So if we can, if our experts and advocates can try and simplify things a little bit, make it a little more understandable for folks who are just trying to comply and file their taxes on time every year. That's what we try to do. But let me hone in on the tax complexity study that you referenced. So every year, my colleague Damian Brady at National Taxpayers Union Foundation puts out a study estimating the amount of hours that we spend filing our taxes and complying with the tax code every year, and the cost there. And you highlighted the numbers there. It's 6.55 million hours. Our headline is actually $100 billion short. The cost is $360 billion. And that's a combination of it's out-of-pocket costs, like, if you hire an accountant, the cost to hire that accountant. If you use TurboTax or H&R Block or some other software, the cost that you incur to buy that software, and it's the opportunity cost, right? You could be making money doing something else, or you could just be enjoying your weekend. I mean, how many times have you talked to someone, and you ask them what they did on the weekend around this time of year, and they go, "Oh, I had to do my taxes all weekend." That's time that we could be enjoying and doing other things.
Yeah, no kid. Yeah, I want to put you on the spot a little bit, and I want you to complete this sentence. The tax system, the federal tax system that we have in America, and the way we collect taxes in America is... Complete that sentence.
Way too complicated, and it is primarily Congress's fault. There's our tax code. So just the instruction book for the Form 1040. That's the individual income tax return that most Americans have to fill out. Just the instruction book for that this past year was 257 pages long. Back in 1965, it was about, I think about 20 pages, if I've got my memory correct. And this is, the IRS. There's a lot of blame to go around for the IRS. The IRS's customer service has been terrible in recent years. Its technology is way outdated. There's enforcement practices that are problem. Really, a lot of the blame falls at the feet of Congress. Congress has just added layer after layer after layer to our tax code, year after year after year. They've made the tax code thousands of pages long. They've loaded it up with all these deductions and credits and exemptions that have just made simply complying and filing your taxes year after year, more and more complicated, more and more time consuming, and more expensive.
Yeah, I was talking with a friend of mine today, and he has a small business, and so his quarterly payment was due, I guess, at the end of last week, and then of course his personal taxes were due yesterday. He was just, you could just see how much it weighs on him that he is constantly dealing with these sorts of things, and he's got a very good accountant who takes care of all this stuff. But again, it's It's the fear. There's always that little bit of unknown because there's so many different ways of interpreting tax law, and no one is really 100% sure if they have the right answer or you're doing things the right way. And I said to him, and this is something I've been saying for years now, that in all these calls, it seems to me for a flat tax or a tax form that you could fill out on something the size of a postcard would be the fairest and the most equitable way to do things. But I said to him, that will never happen because it is the source from which lawmakers in Washington draw their power. And if they can keep this tax code necessarily complex as it possibly can be, they draw power. That's a source of power for them, and they're never going to give that up.
It keeps them busy.
Yeah.
It keeps members of Congress busy, and it keeps, I'm talking to you from Washington D.C. It keeps the city of Washington D.C. busy. But I do, I feel for your friend who's a small business owner, especially if you're a small business owner, right? It's you have these multiple layers of taxation, and what you're doing is you're either hiring an accountant, and obviously that comes at a cost to you, but maybe you have some more certainty that, you're doing things 100% right and get it. There are a lot of small business owners out there who are just starting up or they're sole proprietors and they can't afford to hire an accountant yet. And unfortunately the IRS in their enforcement practices, they've often, there's been a culture at the agency of guilty until proven innocent, rather than the other way around, which is what it should be, And that's something that we're trying to encourage change at the IRS, and we're trying to encourage lawmakers to force the IRS to change. But, there's a lot of valid concerns about how the IRS actually does its audits, does its enforcement right now.
Yeah. That's the thing. You said you're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. And, I don't know how familiar you are with the Cincinnati Bengals, but the owner of the Cincinnati Bengals, Mike Brown, 2 times had to go to tax court against the IRS, and he won both of those cases, which is, to my way of thinking, unprecedented and unheard of. He's a great businessman. He gets a lot of criticism for the way he runs the team, but when it comes to doing business and keeping things uptight, if you face off with the IRS in tax court, not once, but 2 times and win that, how rare is a situation like that?
Well, and and the IRS, it really does call their whole litigation and their whole, sort of legal strategy into question. There are cases that the IRS ends up in the Supreme Court on, and the rulings are 9-0. Now, I think you and your listeners know how divisive, how politically tense things are at the Supreme Court right now. How often do they rule 9-0 on cases? The IRS is often having 9-0 rulings against them at the Supreme Court. So their litigation and legal strategy is certainly all over the map.
Yeah. The National Taxpayers Union Foundation recently put out a press release. I'm looking at it right now, and in that press release, you talk about the IRS budget that is over $80 billion for the IRS, and I guess they haven't hired those 87,000 new agents yet. But when you look at the size and the growth of the IRS, not only in terms of dollars but of manpower, what does that signal for the average American, do you think?
Well, it signals that I think the IRS is going to get a lot more creative, and I think more persistent on its audit and its enforcement efforts. I know the Biden administration, the sort of public-facing message from them has been all about the taxpayer services that'll improve as a result of this funding. But the taxpayer services funding is $3 billion out of the $80 billion. It's a small slice of the pie, and the vast majority of the funding, over half of it, is specifically for enforcement purposes. And so, the administration has pledged that, if you're making under $400,000, well, your chances of being audited won't rise relative to historical levels. But for example, they haven't defined what historical levels mean. Are they looking 50? Are they looking, there's so much room for creativity here in how you sort of measure their promises and their pledges, and we're concerned.
Yeah, well, and I think we all should be concerned. When we talk about the IRS and we talk about, of course, where do you and I mean, I already mentioned this, but I said politicians are never going to change that. Are there any good ideas out there right now as far as reforming the IRS, reforming the tax system that you think could eventually someday take hold?
Yeah, so to start with the funding, there are a lot of good, smart people, and some of my colleagues at National Taxpayers Union Foundation are part of this effort, trying to get, acknowledging that as long as Joe Biden is president, we're probably not going to repeal the $80 billion in funding. We're probably not going to take it away. But in the interim, can we move some of the funding that's currently, just earmarked for enforcement and move that into taxpayer services? Because some of the taxpayer services initiatives, for example, the IRS in the next couple of years wants to be able to create online, more comprehensive, more modern online accounts for taxpayers that they can they can access and use. It would be more like having a bank account online than sort of the current service, which is very, very bare bones. That's the kind of things that a lot of people could use instead of having to call a customer service line. You could connect with a chat bot that could help you answer some of the more basic tax filing questions that you might have. These are good ideas that should be tested out. That's not to say they're going to work perfectly, but we can pilot them and we can test them. But only if you take some of the funding out of enforcement and put it towards taxpayer services. Because as it stands right now, the IRS is going to run out of the taxpayer services funding in a few years, and then all that's going to be left is the enforcement funding.
Yeah, I have a cousin who is in the accounting business, and he has been doing tax returns for the better part of 30 years, if not longer. And we were talking a few weeks ago, and he was talking about the tax returns, and he does tax returns for some very high income individuals, but the majority of the work that he does are for average middle income Americans. And he was telling me that over the last 2 years, the amount of money that he's seen, and this is just his own anecdotal story and his anecdotal evidence, the amount of money that he's seeing going to the IRS is the highest that he's ever seen in the 30 plus years that he's been doing this kind of work. Does your own research tell you that sort of thing is true? And it leads me back to something again that I say all the time, that we don't have a revenue problem in this country. We have a spending problem in this country because there's plenty of revenue going to the government.
I mean, I would agree with you there. We've got, if you look at all the budget experts here in Washington, they don't always get it right. But when I'm talking about the budget experts, I'm talking about people who are at the Congressional Budget Agency. They're not on the Republican team or the Democratic team, so they call balls and strikes. And what they're saying is that in the next 10 years, our revenue as a percentage of the size of our economy, our GDP, is going to be about stable for the next 10 years. It's going to hover around 19-20% of GDP each and every year. Spending, on the other hand, shooting straight up through the roof. And so, to your point, Dan, we've got revenue holding steady as the size of the economy over the next 10 years, but spending shooting up. That indicates to me that exactly what you're saying. We have a spending problem, not a revenue problem, and we'll see if Washington can get it under control. I'm not optimistic given their track record, but we're trying at National Taxpayers Union Foundation, and we're always trying to send them ideas on where they can cut spending.
Well, I just heard Joe Biden say earlier today that, and I played the soundbite, that he cut the federal deficit by $1.7 trillion. So it seems to me that that we're heading in the right direction. I mean, I don't know.
Oh man,
I'm not putting a lot of stock in that, but Andrew Lautz, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, the deficit's coming down not because of things that President Biden has done, but just because we're coming down from all the pandemic government spending.
Yeah, okay, yeah, and then you can slice and dice the numbers a million different ways to make them make it say what you want to say. Andrew Lautz, Director of Federal Policy at the National Taxpayer Union Foundation. Hey, great talking to you tonight. I really appreciate the time, and I hope we get a chance to do it on down the road. And I'll tell you what, tell everyone there I said keep up the great work, because your website is one that I look at all the time, and get a lot of good information there.
Thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate you having me on, and hope you have a great night.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. We'll do it again sometime. And we got to get to a break. Dan Carroll till midnight tonight, and my buddy Curtis Houck of Newsbusters will join us after the news at the bottom of the hour on 700 WLW.
You'd be surprised at all the things doctors find lodged in people's ears, bugs and rocks and doll shoes and fingernails, plenty of cotton swabs. Now, if this happens to your ears, you could miss my show, the Mike McConnell Show. Luckily, there's a solution. Have a doctor yank the junk out of your ear hole